Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got another roundup overview for you guys this month, for the month of May. These are just kind of superficial reviews on some things I've been listening to. All of it's new to me, but maybe not necessarily with a 2021 release date, things that I've just been in rotation. Nothing too much of a deep dive just yet, but just some general impressions on things that maybe things you might want to investigate further, and maybe things that I might want to investigate further in another review a little bit further in the future. But for now, we should probably go ahead and get started. So first up is Mogwai's 2021 release, As the Love Continues. Mogwai is a band that's been around for a while. Their roots lay back in the mid-90s, but I'm brand new to them. I've actually never really checked out Mogwai up close. And then I recently heard about this album, this recent release, and some were saying that it's a very good overview of the band's career. It's a good summation of a lot of the things that they've done up to this point. So it seemed like a pretty decent entry point. They had this kind of interesting meeting point between like Sigur Rós, M83, and Tordin. As the Love Continues to give me a really good first impression of Mogwai. And again, if there are people who are out there that are more familiar with Mogwai's catalog, I would very much welcome an idea about where to go next. Because if this album is just a summary of the best and kind of maybe not the best things that they've done, I would really like to see some of their top-notch work, because I think this album is really fantastic. Although there is a couple of tracks in here. One of them is a vocal track, and one of them is a track that has some singing on it. In general, it's very convincing instrumentals. I know that Mogwai has done some instrumental soundtrack work in their career, and I can definitely see how that would work. They're definitely a visual aspect to what they do. I really can't speak highly enough of just the quality and the variety of sounds on the album are just beyond comprehension. The opening track that we just heard, that distorted bass with the sub octave bass on it is just phenomenally moving, and it has this sense of, even though there's really not a groove that they're producing with that bass line, just the sound quality, the distortion that's on it gives it this sense of motion that almost like negates the need for groove. It's very impressive and very effective, not just in terms of the note choices and the way that the bass line works with the harmony, but just the timbral qualities of the groove. And that persists throughout the album. Their awareness of the sounds and sound quality is absolutely key, I think, to the effectiveness of this album. Okay, next up is Fugazi's Steady Diet of Nothing. Fugazi is a early 90s post-punk, post-hardcore band. Very, very influential group. And again, this is another group that I've really never checked out. My recent experience listening to Koriki earlier this year, which consists of a couple of Fugazi members, I really love that album, and due to my experience with that album, wanted to take the chance, go in there and get into Fugazi. It's not like I've ever had anything against them. In the early 90s, I wasn't in the market. Now, in the band's opinion, Steady Diet of Nothing was a bit more of a democratic and in some ways conservative album for them. But my understanding is that a lot of people like this album. It's kind of a favorite among fans. But there is something kind of timeless about Fugazi and what they do. And certainly, as interesting as their music is, sort of their creation of the idea of straight edge punk rock music, of caring too much, having music that's angry and aggressive because you care too much about what you're singing about, is definitely appealing and has had a long-term, I think, influence on lots of bands from there on out. So Fugazi is an important band, and this is an enjoyable album by them. And definitely kind of shows some of the beginnings of the songwriting that I really enjoy a lot on Koriki. I think that some of it's sort of masked in sort of the trappings of punk rock and post-hardcore, buried in riffs and buried in hollered vocals, but still the songwriting is there. And the more I listen to it, the more that the nuances of the album reveal themselves. Okay, next up is Ghost Against Ghost, Still Love. This is an album that just kind of came up on my Facebook feed, featured artist thing. And I sort of see these things a lot as a person who scans through a lot of music. The algorithm loves me for this sort of thing. But I checked it out, and it kind of got my attention because it definitely has this sense of being a kind of a progressive rock, space rock type album. And what really was the big hook was that you could have gotten the CD for free. And since CD is my medium of choice, it seemed like a no-brainer to check this one out. Now, I have a whole lot of respect for Ghost Against Ghost because I think that there's a lot of passion and a lot of thought and a lot of creativity that went into creating this album. Thing. It has a sense of being a home recording, which kind of in some ways is to his benefit, some ways to his detriment. I think the thing that really kind of bothers me the most about it sound-wise is the drums. I think it very clearly has electric drums, and if it doesn't have electric drums, and the drum sounds are just kind of weird. Especially when he starts, there's parts in here where he plays very frantic and fervent drums in an attempt to build energy, which he does so effectively. But for his hands to be moving as fast, for him to be playing as loudly as he could, the snare drum sound just doesn't seem to be responding to that level of energy. It just sounds real kind of flat dynamically. So that works against it. But on the other hand, it's actually, once you get out of the drum sounds, there's a very deep, rich sense to the album. It has extended ambient passages, which I think are kind of an interesting take on this. There's not as many progressive rock or whatever this is kind of albums that really just do extended ambience as a track. And they're very effective in that regard. I like the ambient tracks on this one, so that's another plus, another thing that makes this album very distinctive. It sort of has this like slightly gothic sense to it, kind of like Pure Reason Revolution had a few years ago when they made their album The Dark Third in the late aughts, and that's a great album. I think it's a compliment to compare this album to that one. Also, the band Anathema has that sense of really kind of dark, melodic, passionate sense to it that Anathema has at their best moments. Okay, next up is Deep Thoughtus, their self-titled, I suppose, debut album. Deep Thoughtus is a Norwegian duo, kind of an avant-garde jazz group from a certain perspective. A guitarist and a drummer. It has a relationship to jazz, but also, I think, also has one foot in sort of the post-rock sound. Certainly, if you're going to call this a jazz album, it's pretty far outside the bounds of what would be considered regular, normal mainstream jazz. Now, there's some moments on Deep Thoughtus I think they're a little messy. When they take their kind of free jazz approach a little bit too literally, and it gets a little bit too busy to really be as effective as it could be. But there are also some fantastic high moments on this album that I really enjoy, especially the ones where they kind of get out of traditional instrumentation. There's a couple tracks on there that have like experimental sort of metallic sounds into it. I can't quite place what they are, like just a whole groove based on this large metallic sound. And that's one example, but whenever this album has that kind of structure, where it takes those kind of chances, it's very effective. And I really like its meditative quality. It's got a sense of being passionate and being emotional in its delivery, but also is very contemplative. Even in its messier moments, it has that feeling of being kind of placid and peaceful, despite its kind of more chaotic nature. And next up is this month's visit to the Prog Corner. And it's odd because in this particular month's roundup overall, several of these groups could kind of be considered prog. I think that you could argue that even though Mogwai is considered to be a post-rock band, there's a component of what they do is definitely prog. And I think that there's a kind of a crossover, I think, between what's considered post-rock music and prog rock music. But I don't think that you can really argue the prog credentials of Rick Wakeman, especially on this new album of his, The Red Planet. Rick Wakeman, classic, yes, keyboardist. And in my opinion, probably the best rock keyboardist of all time. My earliest memories of listening to music was listening to Rick Wakeman's Journey to the Center of the Earth on my parents' orange shag carpet, and checking out the liner notes and following the storyline of that album. And Rick Wakeman has a very long history, very long and extended catalog with a lot of varied results. Some of his albums are really great, some of them are really not so great. But I think on this album, he's really making an effort to kind of call back to his most classic sounds and the style of playing and the keyboards, the sounds that he used that really made him what he is, the sounds that he's most identified with. Now here's the deal. When you start getting into progressive rock, especially the keyboardists, you're always going to have to deal with some level of corniness and cliche, you know. I was never really a fan of Keith Emerson because I think some of what he does is kind of corny. That doesn't mean that Rick Wakeman is without his corny moments. You're talking about a guy that decided to put one of his rock operas on ice and do an ice skating version of it. So there's some hokiness going on there. But generally speaking, this album definitely lives up to some of his best moments. But there's some hokey things on there. He does a couple of things with the Bender that really in 2021 is a bit anachronistic. And I just feel like we can't ever get through anything dedicated to Mars without somehow quoting Mars, the Bringer of War. And he does it on this album. Right towards the end, the last track on the album is not exact quote of Mars, the Bringer of War, but it's not in 5/4, but it's still triplets and quarter notes and that same kind of thundering sound. And, you know, of course, Keith Emerson did that already. King Crimson did that already. Everybody's kind of taking their stab at this. So I guess it was Rick Wakeman's chance to do it too. But it would have been a little bit more convincing if we'd have been able to dodge that particular cliche this time around. But aside from that, I think this is a really great example of Rick Wakeman's keyboard playing. And he's still producing. After all this time, what he does, I mean, it's not a big digression for him. It's still what he's always done. But he does it so well and it's so, you know, fun to listen to. His really angular keyboard leads on the Moog. It's just, I can't help but be attracted to that. Okay, finally, it's Cynic's Traced in Air. Now, this is the album that I got into earlier this year after really falling in love with Focus last year. And Traced in Air has an interesting history to it because, you know, after Focus, Cynic broke up and they kind of just went their own separate ways. And that was in 1994 and ended up doing a reunion show in the mid-2000s, somewhere in there, and discovered that there was actually a huge fan base, a huge cult following that had garnered themselves around the work that they had done. So they regrouped in 2008 and they created Traced in Air. Now, there's a lot about Traced in Air that's a big step forward from Focus. I mean, you can tell it's the same band. Okay, let's start with that. But there's a lot of things that are different about it. I think it's a decidedly more progressive rock album than Focus was. Focus still had one foot pretty firmly in death metal. And this one really pushes more towards the progressive rock side. It's still, don't get me wrong, it's still a progressive metal album. And as such, it's very interesting because it doesn't show its roots quite as clearly as some other progressive rock acts. Like Queensryche definitely has a lot that they owe to Pink Floyd. Dream Theater has a lot that they owe to Yes. Okay, but the influences that Cynic has aren't nearly as obvious because I think they came by their own evolution in a little bit more introverted way. But really, like, the stuff that they do on this album that's different really is just an extension of what they've already done. It's not a huge different thing, but it's definitely a huge leap forward in just the complexity and the emotive boundaries of what their music is capable of. lot more clean singing on this. The guitar player is taking a little bit more melodic leads on it. More confident singing, but still has kept this vocoder shade to his voice. So it still has that cool cybernetic quality to it that I really loved about Focus. I noticed also that Sean Malone's bass playing isn't quite as pronounced sound-wise as it was in the previous one, but his stick sounds are much better. So that's a kind of a funny trade-off for me. But again, his bass playing, although it's a little more hidden than it is on Focus, is still pretty phenomenal once you can open your ears to it. And then Sean Reinhardt's drumming is off the charts. From the very beginning, this album announces his presence, and it almost feels like, as you're listening to it, this is the thing that kind of pushed Tool towards playing more progressive rock styles. I don't know, I have to look at the timeline on that. But it just feels like there's a relationship between what Cynic was doing here and what Tool was starting to do around the time of, Lateralis and 10,000 Days. There's something going on with that it feels like there's a connection. And maybe it's not that they're listening to each other, but maybe that's just the zeitgeist of the time. But certainly, Tres Tener is a huge improvement in many ways over Focus, and it's not to denigrate Focus, because I still think that's a masterful album. But Cynic is in its own ballpark. It's a mammoth album, and I think one that you can listen to almost endlessly and find new, deep things about it, which I will find out, because I'm not going to put this one away anytime soon. I'm really enjoying it, okay? This is my 6 albums I have for you guys this month for May, and I really appreciate you hanging around. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. Share it out with your friends. Please remember to support artists, okay, during this time. If you're going to buy, listen to music, please try to buy directly from artists. Also follow me over on Spotify. I got put tracks up from this playlist over there. And then that's it for this time. So I'll see you soon. Till then, catch you on the flip side.